on today's episode of The Mythic Masculine.
Most people have difficulty seeing the water that we're swimming in. When we bring animals other than humans in from the wild, so either humans domesticate them or we take wild animals and say we put them in a zoo. Okay, so they're not domesticated, but they're in captivity. One of the first things that happens is that they start to lose their ability to naturally survive in their original context. So that's one of the first things. But also they tend to not mate well. They start to have difficulties in their mating lives. So, the challenges that we have as domesticated people can be related to understanding our context.
What does it mean to be a man? And what kind of masculinity is needed to meet these uncertain times? In an era defined by polarized conflict and existential threat, how can we draw upon the rich lineage of mythopoetics to navigate this terrain? I'm your host, Ian McKenzie, and together with an array of guests, we'll explore various pathways to realign masculinity with thriving life. Greetings, dear listener. I'm your host, Ian McKenzie. My guest today is Victor Waring, a somatic educator and founder of Rewilding Eros, a body-centered path to reclaiming our natural erotic intelligence. In our conversation today, Victor invites us to look deeply at the condition of modern men, domesticated human animals cut off from the wild currents that once shaped our bodies, relationships, and souls. He names how much of our struggle with intimacy, desire, and disconnection is not personal failure, but the inheritance of a culture that has forgotten the way of village. Together, we explore the meaning of rewilding Eros, how centuries of colonization and conditioning have constricted men's vitality, and how we might return to a more embodied, enlivened masculinity. We speak of civilization and desire, patriarchy and the loss of community, the tyranny of the dyad, and the hunger for wholeness that haunts the modern man. Victor reminds us that Eros is not merely sex, but the living current of aliveness itself, an invitation for men to reclaim their erotic sovereignty and rejoin the flow of life. Before we begin, you're invited to check out my website, The Mythic Masculine, to explore upcoming in-person and online offerings, as well as one-on-one mentorship. You can also find how to become a paid supporter on Substack. This podcast is a true labor of love, and I have never accepted advertising. Instead, I rely on listeners like you to fund the show. So if you found insight and wisdom in these conversations, please consider upgrading your membership. Visit themythicmasculine.com for more details. And now, enjoy my conversation with Victor Waring. Welcome, Victor, to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Mm-hmm. Would you please share a little of where you are in this moment, geographically, physically, spiritually?
Geographically, I am in the Pacific Northwest in Ashland, Oregon, which is basically whenever I say Ashland or when I say Oregon, people think it's wet and moist. I always like to let them know it's actually basically Northern California. So Ashland, Oregon. And you said spiritually, and what else?
And emotionally, whatever so the listener can attune to in the moment.
Yeah, great. So I'm a somatically based person. So I would just say my body right now feels pretty rooted and grounded. There's a little bit of caffeine in me, so the upper part of me is a little jangly. And emotionally, I feel pretty good in this moment, and I'm assuming we're cut in the same cloth a little bit, and I'm definitely feeling a lot of what's happening in the world right now.
Mm-hmm.
So that's in here. Yeah, and spiritually, feeling big, open. I feel curious. Curious curious where we will go. It's not quite spiritually, but that'll do.
Thank you, Victor.
Yeah.
I am excited for this conversation because I've been tracking your work for some time now, probably at least over a year, when my co-director on the film The Village of Lovers, Julia Marianska, interviewed you for our Summer of Love series. And and since then I've been tracking your Instagram, and so much of what you've been posting I've been really appreciating. And so somehow I felt the time had come for us to jump on a direct conversation, and I'm glad you said yes. And this conversation is probably going to circle around the themes of Eros. What does it mean to rewild, which of course is the name of your offering, and more specifically also masculinity and village, of course, because this also again straddles the village of lovers and the work that and the ways that I've been impacted by Tamara and community, which seems to also be a big part of your work as well. Similar frames around this stuff. So I'd love to start with the first question, which is, what does it mean to rewild Eros? And second part, why is this significant for men in particular?
Great. So yeah, like you said, Ian, rewilding or rewilding Eros, it's the overall name of what I do. And I do that from a body-centered, somatic perspective. And for me, what that means is that and when I say we, it's easy to say we and just mean, but when I say we, I mean myself, I mean most of the people that I know as fairly domesticated human apes living in mostly colonized cultures, that we have been cut off from large swaths of what I would call our native, our indigenous, our natural, somatic, and erotic intelligence. And in fact, we're in a fair amount of fear and resistance and avoidance of those things that's taught to us from our culture, which is carried down through us through many generations of domestication. So when I name rewilding as a thing to do, as a path to possibly go, it means to reconnect to these parts of us that are in ourselves, that are in our bodies, that are in our flesh and in our sinew and in our evolutionary DNA, and the things that we often see at odds with ourselves in the modern world are often quite helpful, nourishing, grounding, and healthy for us. And in fact, oftentimes when I'm working with people, what I notice is that a lot of the things that we feel a lot of distress about in terms of our sexuality and in terms of our relationships are artifacts of our domestication rather than specific problems related to us. Or as I like to say to people, you're not broken. You and I, we're not broken. And usually I'm talking in the realm of sex, sexuality, eros, our bodies, relationships. We feel broken. And it's hard to come out from underneath that lens. I mean, I have to work on that myself. I can see myself and other people as like, oh, there's something wrong. And pathologizing. So we're not broken, but we live in contexts that don't really support who we are as human animals. So rewilding to me is helping people move things out of the way that they identify in themselves that interfere with that. So specifically for men, because you were asking about men, I think in our particular culture, so I'll narrow it down to more specifically us. And by that, I mean United States, Westernish culture, Canada. I think men are particularly well, everyone's impacted, but men are particularly impacted in ways that are really harmful to us, and not only harmful to us, but also part of our culture since it is patriarchal culture, a male-centered culture, it's also saying that how we're doing it is actually the way it's to be done. So the harm that can happen in our domestication is not only like, oh, this is hard on us, but we also are really invested in, and this is good. This is right. We are doing it right. We've got this. So that's a hard role.
Hmm. Well, it makes me think of, well, first, for folks listening as well, I think it's really important to state that what you're speaking to, and these frames around domestication, colonization, is basically what informs our capacity to understand or to see or to perceive what seems, I don't know, quote, normal or not, or normative, right, or not. This is how I would understand it. And just to give an example, like when I went to Tamera, the project in Portugal, of course, we made the film about the Village of Lovers, the film is called. That to me, by being in a very different context, revealed to me how incomplete or dysfunctional the context of which you might call, domestication is for love relationships, in particular partnerships, right? It was only until I was in a different context that I was able to see,
Right.
oh, wow, okay, right. And it's like, again,
Yeah.
the metaphor is something like the water that the fish are swimming in. It's like you don't know that it's a particular kind of context because it's all you've ever known. And right, yeah. So I think it's important to state that. So for those listening, and particularly for men, they might say, well, this is the way it is. It should be. But that's a very particular contextual understanding that takes a lot of like deconditioning, I think, and maybe rewilding, as you're saying, to even like see the domestication, right? To even come to understanding, or and to see and to understand what colonization has actually done. Yeah, maybe you have to say more. I just wanted to emphasize that for the listener.
Yeah, Ian, I'd say that's 100% correct. So, I mean, a lot of my work is education about the context, and most people have difficulty seeing the water that we're swimming in. I consider myself lucky in some ways. I haven't spent that much time outside of these contexts, but my one of my areas that I chose to spend a lot of time in when I was studying was cultural anthropology, which is all about different contexts. So I got to see, at least from an academic level, like, oh, yeah, we're doing this through a particular lens, and we always assume our lens is the true lens. And then when you match that against, we've been humans now for about, they keep bumping it up. It was like 250,000 years, and now they're like saying, oh, maybe modern humans, maybe like 300,000 years. So we've been doing that for a while, and really like 10 to 15,000 years, we've been like kind of doing this. So we've spent so much more time in radically different contexts that are really just part of our being.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a film, which probably I'm sure you've seen, called American Beauty with...
a long time ago.
Yeah. Let's just talk about the character. Lester Burnham, who's the character in the film. He's middle class, white, suburban America. And his archetype in that film is very much I would call it like the domesticated man. Right. He's sort of working a job he hates. His wife doesn't respect him. His kid hates him. I would say like his inner fire, his connection to Eros is non-existent. The fire went out. And so I think it might be helpful for some of the listeners to understand like what is that kind of archetypally could look like, right? As a kind of extreme example. And in that film in particular, he goes through an awakening process to kind of like rekindle this connection to Eros. And in many ways, he kind of regresses back to adolescence, right? He sort of, gets a job at a pizza or a fast food joint. He, quits his job. He sort of acts like a rebellious teenager, smokes pot, right? And there's some kind of heroic arc in that, like this willingness to rebel, right? And yet at the same time, it's kind of adolescent. But so I want to give another frame too in the men's work I do, which is influenced largely in the mythopoetic by Robert Bly, who wrote the book Iron John. Yeah, and of course he has the archetype of the wild man in that book. And when I often introduce that to listeners or audiences, both men and women, they might say, Oh, the wild man is like the violent man, right? The wild man is the one that is like dangerous, right? Because they see the kind of conflict and violence that men perpetuate. And they say, oh, that's what he's speaking to. And Bly actually, in later years, actually had to clarify. Well, he does in the book as well. He distinguishes between what he says is the wild man and the feral man, right?
Hmm.
Or the savage man, I guess he says, right? The savage man. And he said that was very important because the way that we're talking now, I would say to the colonized mind or the domesticated mind, it's only like the domesticated man or the domesticated Eros, let's say, or it's the kind of violent, carnage expression of man, right? There's no other version of man, archetype of man that is actually could be understood to be wild. And when you say rewild in this sense, I think what you're talking to is like reconnected to like the primal intelligence of sensation and life itself. I think that's what
Yeah.
you're speaking to, right? So I wanted to
Yeah.
offer those frames, right? So when you were talking about rewilding, you're not talking about a rebellious teenager or a kind of
No.
violent expression. It's a different kind of something, and I'd love for you to speak to that.
Sure. Yeah. So wild in this sense, of course, people hear the word wild and they think crazy, or they think dangerous, or they think out of control, just all of those things. And so that's not what I mean. And in fact, I would put out there that I experience personally, and I think we experience collectively, more violence, more harm within civilization than wild people do. So when I say wild, I'm talking about who we are as undomesticated creatures, wild humans or wilder humans. So I tell people to think of indigeneity, think of hunter gatherer. And not that I'm saying that we need to become those things. I mean, we can incorporate some of those things. It's part of us, but to think in that way. So it doesn't mean going crazy. It means recovering more of who we are as authentic human creatures. And in many ways, it's very different than what we have become as domesticated creatures. And then I like going through with people like all the different places where that impacts from. I mean, we won't do it all today, but economics and social structures and how we work and how we sex and how we relationship and all of things. So yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and it's very much part of our. I'll use the other word I use a lot, civilized, domesticated mindset to think that things that are closer to nature are more crazy, are more wild in the negative sense, or are more untrustworthy or worthy of our fear. And that's a big part of our, patriarchy piece is that, in patriarchy, we tend to see women and women's bodies as closer to that, and therefore they're crazy and they are unpredictable and they need to be controlled. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Mm. So you gave all those different categories, and one again you named is sex. And I'd be curious if you could unpack a bit too. What does domesticated sex? And I don't necessarily mean the act of sex, but more like,
Sure.
what is the domesticated qualities that you see for men in particular around their relationship to like sex and eros? What does it look like to be domesticated, like to as recognizable aspects of this?
Great. So I'll start it off with this frame. So maybe it makes it easier for people to get. So when we bring animals other than humans in from the wild, so either humans domesticate them or we take wild animals and say we put them in a zoo. Okay, so they're not domesticated, but they're in captivity. One of the first things that happens is that they start to lose their ability to naturally survive in their original context. So that's one of the first things. But also they tend to not mate well they start to have difficulties in their mating lives. So, not all animals, but like we'll hear stories about like, oh, the pandas in the zoo that we can't figure out, why aren't they mating? The gorillas in the zoo, whatever. And then we tend to try to impose sort of our idea of what mating looks like. So let's say with a gorilla, they used to like put gorillas, they'd have a pair of gorillas and they'd like, okay, breed now. And they're like, well, the context for gorillas isn't a male gorilla and a female gorilla in a married dyad, with a wedding cake. Gorillas live in a particular way. And the way gorillas live is they live with usually a silverback surrounded by a bunch of females and some other people. And when they start to do that, they're like, oh, okay, I get it. Now they're starting to mate. That is their context. So anyway, I like to start off with that so that we understand that the challenges that we have as domesticated people can be related to our context and understanding our context.
Yeah. So then for me, those are great examples to say the context of, let's say, these animals, right? If their context is off, the flow of Eros, right, seems to be, more shut down. So that of course makes me think of a lot of modern context for couples and partnerships, for example. About 13 or so years ago, I ended up going through a divorce, and that relationship prior to was, again, very much this context of, the modern dyad couple living nuclearly, even had a picket fence, it wasn't white, but it was very much that, I wouldn't have said it then. I would have said, oh, this is like the ideal romantic picture. But now I would say it's a very domesticated context. We had somewhat community around kind of thing, but it wasn't like, nothing like I understand now when I understand places like Tamara or other more village contexts. And so I think from that particular context, it becomes very easy to put the pressure on the couple, right, to kind of figure it out, to like be everything to each other, to like the problems of Eros in the relationship, as it often does, right? People talk about they hit the roommate phase, that Eros kind of dies. Makes me think of Esther Perel, of course, mating in captivity.
Yeah.
And so, but people often think that that's a personal problem, right? It's like, oh, our couple is, I'm kind of failing as a man if I can't stoke my woman, or if she's not into it, I'm kind of failing. And I think what you're pointing to is,
I am broken. We are broken.
Yeah, exactly. And you're pointing to actually contextually, that's not actually that aligned with, maybe you could say, a flow of Eros and a connection to the pulse of life, which would naturally enliven a relationship. That's maybe one way I'd say it. Yeah. So I'm curious for you if you could speak more of like how domestication shows up in, particularly for men in relationship to their own Eros and sexuality, and in their partnership, not just hetero partnerships, but just in partnerships in general.
Yeah. So our context, our human context, I like to sum it up in one word, and that's community. Our context is community, village, whatever the word you want to put in there. And our domesticated context is individualistic, dyadic, and nuclear. And so when you take an animal, us, out of that context and put it in here, the changes that happen, what tends to happen is that our sexuality and the way we do sexuality tends to become more contained, more controlled, more pathologized. We tend to pathologize ourselves or moralize our natural impulses. And again, whenever I say natural impulses, people go, what do you mean? We need to just like fuck everybody? And I was like, no, but we have bodily ways that we tend to go, oh, that's wrong. That's bad. That's awful. And so when we in a domesticated context tend to control and contain and push down and limit our natural Eros is really powerful, and sexuality is really powerful. I distinguish between those things often, and I'll say more about that. So stuff happens to it, and the stuff that happens to it is the stuff that a lot of us are familiar with. So things like sexual violence, things like doing harm and trying to control our partners, trying to thinking that our partner's sexuality and their body and their energy belongs to us. And so we need to control it and somehow manage it so that it doesn't do what we don't want it to do. That's domestication. That's some of what we do. And then another piece that's hard, I think, hard for us in that, and you alluded to this earlier, is that when we put ourselves outside of the context of community and inside the context of more nuclearity or the tyranny of the dyad, I call it. Since that is not how our nervous systems and our physiology is really set up to be, that's where Eros tends to fall off. And it tends to fall off more precipitously for women if we're talking heterosexually, in a domesticated context than for men. So oftentimes when people come to see me, or just the general culture tends to go, oh, women have like lower libido, always want sex. I'm like, no, that's not actually what's usually happening. What's happening is the context doesn't support Eros, and it affects women more than men. So, and again, since we are living in patriarchy and male supremacy in our cultures, that what I was talking about in terms of control usually falls, not always, but usually falls to men to be more controlling, to be more, we think of it as power, but it's actually anxiety driven. It's fear driven. Attempting to control other people's bodies, our partners' bodies, the society's bodies. When you think about like what our United States culture and other ones are doing around like sex and sexuality, policy making, things about like who and how you have sex and what sex gets funded and what bodies get supported, medically and all that. That is part of this. And that's definitely connected, I think, to the maleness or the masculinity that can be produced in a context such as this.
Well, thanks for that. I mean, I'm also reading a book, I think it's by a Spanish author. I probably read it, but it's something like Monogamous Terror, Polyamorous Mind, or something like that. I'm not quite getting it.
I don't know that one.
Okay, I'll show it in the show notes. But she makes the case that monogamy itself, I mean, it's directly linked to colonization. And, I think you named it in the other interview with Julia, this idea that the nuclear dyad structure is a much better or easier to control. And I don't mean this in this sort of, kind of Illuminati or something, but more like just for an economic system, it's easier to control these standardized units of dyadic nuclear families. And it's also better for consumerism, obviously, where, everybody has to own their own thing, the kind of classic, everybody needs a lawnmower, on a street instead of, a collective thing. So but the way that we've organized our streets and living arrangements comes from, I understand, particularly in North America, right, which it comes from the structures of war, or like army barracks, very, straight streets, and the way that commodities and things can be delivered, in the network. It's all that there's an efficiency around that to a certain kind of society, certain values in that society, right? And so I want to
90-degree angles.
Yeah, exactly. And so I also want to make a point around, or a curiosity to speak to. Again, this idea of the water we swim in dictates what we think of as normal, as ideal, of where responsibility lies, and the rest. And particularly for a lot of the relational advice that I see online, on Instagram and lots of other places, these relationship coaches and things like that, they'll talk about this dynamics of the man. The man has to lead his woman, right? He has to like take the leadership, and she can surrender to his masculinity and orientation. And even these frames around divine union, right? This idea that, you sort of find your complete other half, and, it seems strangely a little bit like kind of the old, I guess, Christian idealization of man and woman, things like that. But for me, when I see that, right, what I see is that maybe makes sense in the context of domestication, but of course nobody says that, right? Nobody says that. They're like, this is how universally it should go. Not
Yeah.
seeing that, again, it's part of a particular context. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is like, I see the danger of not being able to see the wider context, not to make it necessarily wrong, right? So if people are saying, oh, you're saying monogamy is wrong. No, I would say monogamy is wrong, but I'd say it makes sense actually in a particular context like modern society. Like to live a bit more like the wild, I won't say necessarily polyamorous, but like outside of those kind of dyadic idealism is difficult to do because the rest of the culture doesn't really support, right? From these different from the economic to the emotional support folks. So we are in this time, obviously, where it's not simply just to step outside of domestication. Where this is most clear for me too, and I know you've written about this actually numerous times, is the attachment theory. And I'd be curious for you to speak about actually the difference between domesticized attachment theory and why is it so significant actually when we look at it from, for example, like a community or a village sense of how attachment is developed? Because I think that's actually a really important distinction for folks to understand.
Yeah. So I'll go there, but I want to jump back for a second, what you're talking about with monogamy and non-monogamy, and to say that, and oftentimes when people hear me speak, or I'll say people like me, we're talking about some of the same stuff, they make the assumption that, I think what you're saying is that non-monogamy and polyamory and all of that is like better than monogamy, or that humans are naturally non-monogamous or whatever. And so what I like to let people know is that I think humans are generalists in terms of our sexuality and our relationship style. So I think when you look across the whole of human societies, you will see humans doing all kinds of stuff, from monogamy to non-monogamy to all kinds of stuff that's even hard to put labels on. So we do all kinds of stuff. And so the question is, how does that look in particular contexts? So, and you were alluding to that earlier. So monogamy looks a particular way in what I'm talking about. Even polyamory looks a particular way in what I'm talking about. One of the people who I'm really taken with, I don't know if you know Kim Tallbear. She's an indigenous woman who talks a lot about non-monogamy and polyamory. And what I've heard her say is that polyamory in colonized culture oftentimes ends up looking like monogamy on steroids. So it's the context influences the relationship style. So I wanted to say that. But yeah, as far as attachment goes, I was just writing about that this morning. As far as attachment goes, I think a really quick way to sort of get it is that we talk a lot right now about secure attachment. It's kind of all the rage, and all the other kinds. And those theories are based upon, again, the context of us. So we see secure attachment as being, oh yeah, a child comes into the world and they're raised by their primary caregivers, usually mom and dad, usually what we're talking about, and primarily mom. And so they attach hopefully securely in that family unit. And then when they grow up, that style, that healthy, secure attachment then transfers to connecting with partner. They develop this, secure, nurturing pair bond where everyone feels psychologically and nervous systemically grounded and tuned with each other. So that's how we see it. So I think the simple way of understanding secure attachment in other contexts is to say that I'm going to make a sweeping statement here. I think most indigenous people don't have this, they don't have the word secure attachment, but I would say secure attachment is village in non-domesticated humans. So what we see is you me thing. I think most indigenous people see it as a communal kinship net thing. That is secure attachment. And thinking about it. So one of the Another person who I love, who no longer walks on the earth, is Saban Fusame. And she used to share the story growing up in her village in Burkina Faso, where, she grew up with everyone older adults, everyone was mother and father, you know, that everyone. And she grew up she said, it wasn't until I was like, she said 13, who I really understood who my actual biological mother was.
Mm-hmm.
And that for us kind of blows our mind, but it's just an example of how different attachment is in other places and in other contexts. And I would say contexts that are more related to who we are as human beings. And so, and I think I haven't been to Tamara, but I think Tamara is playing with these things too. Like, what does our security and attachment look like when we live really deeply and intimately connected with a wide net of people? I suspect, and I think other people do too, that it makes our sexual and romantic relationships, it makes them still important, but instead of our sexual and our romantic relationships being up here and everything else being like down here, it kind of goes and it kind of does this, and all these relationships become super important, and our romantic and sexual relationships become a relationship within a web of relationships, which has the benefit, I think, of taking a lot of pressure off of our romantic relationships, and also in a way that sort of is counterintuitive to us, makes Eros more sustainable and regenerative. Because what Eros hates usually is this. No light between us, no separation, no, and this is our cultural model of intimacy. That's a problem. I think. Yeah.
Thanks for that. It strikes me that in some of the work that I do with my collaborator, Dave Fortier, we have a weekend that we offer for men, not just for straight men, also gay men, queer men also attend. But the focus of it is called Awakening the Wild Erotic. And part of what we're trying to do is actually, widen the aperture of what is Eros to include sexuality, but also, again, open it up to a much broader spectrum of being able to experience it. And for a lot of men, that's revelatory, actually, right? Because they now realize that they've been only really conditioned to see Eros in a sexual form, in a sexual expression. And I guess particularly for straight men with women, to see women as the source of like erotic intimacy and sex. Right. So it sets up this really codependent dynamic. And in mythic terms, I call it the King Haggard dynamic, where in the film The Last Unicorn, it's where this tyrant king has basically got the Red Bull to chase all the young unicorn, the young feminine, like into the sea, so he can gaze upon them and feel young again. It's a very like chilling scene in this film based on a book that came out, in I think it was the late 80s, early 80s.
Yeah.
So for allow men to widen their access to Eros and to their own embodiment is a massive part of that, reprogramming, I think.
Yeah.
And it allows them to be, to access that I call it sometimes like the inner wellspring, right? But to basically, take the pressure off that dyadic partnership to be that soul source, and to kind of liberate the expectations, right, and the burden of that.
Yeah. Ian, in a colonized context, it's a lot of that is based on commodification and products and all that kind of thing. And so I think we tend to see, and I'll speak about men, we tend to see Eros as something that we get. It's something outside of ourselves, and it's something that if we do the right things, if we transact in the right way, or just take, that we will get it. So it becomes an externally focused thing. One of the dances that I lead, I call it Dance Eros. It's an erotic, inclusive, ecstatic dance with a whole lot of container making at the beginning of it. One of the things I love to say to the people in that dance is, hey, let's actually start this dance on our own, moving in our erotic sovereignty and really grounding in that. Because what we tend to do is we tend to move towards other people so quickly. We're looking for it out there that we totally forget ourselves in that process. We don't feel ourselves because something's going to come from out there. We're going to get it. And so, yeah, so when I talk about Eros, I talk a lot about erotic sovereignty and the fact that Eros is actually something that comes from you, and that your erotic intelligence and your erotic spirit is something that has been with you all of your life. In fact, I would venture to say before you were born, this like self of you as an erotically sovereign person, it belongs to you. It's older than any relationship, and it's also bigger than sex. Eros to me is life energy. It is aliveness. It is engagement that is sometimes quite nicely focused into the realm of sexuality, but it's much bigger than that.
Mm.
And that's a really important thing to get to understand, because not a lot of people do. And so you can do anything with Eros. You can go shopping erotically. You could drive your car erotically. You can, I'm going to say this, and I don't mean it in a weird way, but you can like raise your children erotically. It doesn't mean, we're talking about sex. It means that you're engaged and embodied within that. So I love making that distinction between sex and Eros. And sometimes what I'll describe it for people is, when we think about sex, and it's not making one bad and good or whatever, but I think of sex as the pros of behavior, or the nuts and bolts. Like sex is, yeah, certain body parts touch other body parts, and those things happen. Maybe a body part enters another body part, or rubs up against another body part. That's sex. Eros is more like the poetry of why. So sex is the quality, the nature of it, the thing that actually draws us back to and creates desire. And so the way to frame it is, there are lots of people that have sexual experiences that are completely devoid of Eros. And usually when I say that in front of a crowd of people, people go, yeah, I've had lots of those. I've had lots of sexual experiences that were not erotic. So people can get that.
Yeah, thanks for that. I was imagining this kind of hooked dependency that a lot of men have, not just men, of course, but on pornography, and how pornography itself, right, has this. I mean, I think Carolyn Casey, right, has this phrase called toxic mimic, but it has this thing. Yeah, it's this idea of almost like it's this commodity, right? This sexual commodity of women, or some depiction of sex or eroticism, but it's essentially commodified and sold back to men. I mean, again, not just men, but because they can't access it within is one way I think I might understand it, right? Because it's like, how can you sell something to somebody who has free access to it everywhere, right? It just seems like, again, I see this in the repatterning. It's not so much like demonizing pornography, or telling a man that he's just got to use his willpower to get over it, and like the moral dimension, which can all be valuable lenses. But I see ultimately a man, and this is also what we touch on in our offerings, but if they can develop the capacity to access this wellspring, right, this source, then the dependency just naturally kind of falls away and dissipates, right? Because it's no longer trying to be satiated through these commodified channels.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting too, Ian, because porn is such a lightning issue for a lot of people. And I always like to look at it again from an evolutionary context, from a human context, and that is, when as soon as humans were able to like translate their experiences into some other kind of media, drawing, painting, stone art, whatever. As soon as we were able to do that, we were depicting sex. We just were. humans have always been interested, fascinated by our bodies and by sexual experiences and pleasure, and translating that into something that was able to be taken in outside of the actual experience. So in that vein, I always say to people, porn is part of our heritage. It just is. And again, I'm going to overuse this word, beat it to death, context. So it shapes itself to our particular way of being. And so in our particular way of being, again, commodification, taking power over, control, sort of unusual permutations of eros and sexuality because of containment. The way we look at, consume, and feel desire for porn kind of looks like how we are, which is so. So anyway, that's the framework that I put it in.
Yeah.
And so when I'm speaking with men and women too, but men about pornography, I try to meet people where their values are. A lot of times people are like, I would like to have this aspect of my life carry less importance to me, for it to be less significant, either for myself or my values, or because my partner, it lands with my partner in ways that I don't particularly like. And I'm like, I can support that. And also I want to really support the shaming, the desire for erotic experience that is like outside of ourselves in that way. Because I say that's actually very deeply human. Let's talk about how we're going to explore that, or explore it differently, or shape it differently.
Yeah. Thanks for that. I'd love to actually go way back now to so just some of your own origin story as well. Because, again, we went right into the journey, and I've been really appreciating the conversation. And I'm curious what drew you to have such an interest, in this kind of stuff in your own upbringing. And of course, your Instagram handle is called Bonobo Man. And I'm wondering, I interviewed on this podcast as well Christopher Ryan, who wrote Sex at Dawn, right? Where I think, maybe not the only one, but certainly he popularized that notion, right, of that bonobos being more close to humans than chimps. And I'm just curious if there was a inspiration there or not. But however way you found it, I'd be curious to hear. Yeah, this is obviously something you're really passionate about and love exploring and talking about. And I wonder how this came to be.
Yeah, I spent a little time here. So I'll start with Bonobo, or Bonobo Man. So that's older than Chris Ryan. It's older than Sex at Dawn. That's a great book. So Bonobo Man. I think I said to you earlier, one of my studies, my undergrad major was anthropology. So that's where I first encountered bonobos and my primatology courses, and I was like, oh, I like these guys. I like these animals. And at first, they're shocking because of the sex and sexuality piece. That's the first thing that people talk about bonobos about. But they're just amazing creatures, in terms of their social organization, in terms of their violence or lack thereof, in terms of how they interact with each other and how they negotiate over things like resources, and their social, and again their social structure is matriarchal. There's the bands are typically led by coalitions of female bonobos that maintain their sense of power through their coalition. And so males in those bands, I mean, from what we've seen, we project a lot on them. They seem happy enough. It's not the inverse of patriarchy. But if and when male behavior is challenging in a troop, the females in there are like, yeah, no. And they have enough what chutzpah to back that up. And so anyway, that was my inspiration. No, man, I love the creature. I love the creatures. They are um, just beautiful creatures, and there's this amazing sort of triadic paradox, that's the right word, between between humans and bonobos and chimpanzees, where we sort of like represent slightly different versions of each other. Chimpanzees are notably more violent, notably more patriarchal, notably more like territorial in hard ways with each other. And then humans, we got a lot of all of it. So so that's that. But my mythopoetic creation story is, I'll start really early and say that I was the kid growing up whose mom was in medicine, and who I had a lot of interest, and I got a lot of information that I would say was described as being like a little bit above my pay grade. Especially in terms of the body and sexuality, nothing beyond what I should have. But my mom was just very open and honest. And so I had a lot of information, and I had a lot of interest, and I tended to be the person when I was a kid, talking about, adolescence and then teenagerhood, that, in my friend group, I would know a lot of stuff, or people would come to me. So there was that. And then I'll jump to the next piece, which is the whole anthropology piece and the whole movement embodiment piece. So I was dancing, I studied modern dance as well, and contact improv. But the whole piece about humans and human culture, it's always been a part of my story. I was like, oh, I have a feeling the way we're doing it is not the way it's done, or it's not the way it's done everywhere. And so I was always interested in that. And so anthropology was like, yeah, no, that's true. Like, humans do it all kinds of ways all over the world. And so, you learn all the anthropological terms like cultural relativity and all that kind of stuff. So that was that. And then I'll jump to studying in my grad school, which was somatic psychology. Don't know if you know of Naropa University.
A little bit.
Shout out. Okay, I'll shout out to Naropa. But they had a somatic psychology graduate program, and that was when I first dove into, at least at academic and somatic level, somatics, how to be with people in a therapeutic context that was about the body, and not the body excluding the mind, going, brain consciousness, that's body too. It's all body. So that was the introduction to somatics. And then finally, deciding to be, actually realizing in my somatic program, and sorry, Naropa, in that program, we did not have anything that I recall that was specifically related to sexuality. And I remember at the time I was like, how do we have a somatic program that doesn't include sexuality? What, again, it's like, what are the blinders? What are we missing? Anyway, so years later, I was like, I want to work with this specifically because it's in me, and also it's just important. It's important work. And so then I studied to be a somatic sexuality educator and a sexological body worker. And so all those things kind of weave together into what I do, what I love to do.
Thank you for that. I'm struck by the I guess pursuit of maybe what I might understand or translate around somatic bodywork and sexological bodywork of, like, I don't know if you might use these language, like unblocking or dissolving traumas, and ways in which there's constriction, and like the body isn't fully able to allow in and to express like the fullness of, I don't know, vitality or the erotic current. Maybe that's one way I might say that. I think if your exploration of that as in support for the individuals seems clear, right? To be able to work on that. And then I see how that might naturally kind of draw in, of course, a sense of like, well, how did we get this way? Like, how did so many people get constricted and like traumatized and, have attachment issues and all these things? And of course, then looking at the context, it's like, oh, because of the way society is structured and because of the way we're living. So it's kind of like one naturally seems to bleed you to the other. It seems, right? Because you can only really do, I think, individual work for so long, right? Before you're like, wait a second, like, why is this happening, right? Why do we have these common patterns in people and trauma signatures and things? So I can see that,
right? And why was it in thinking like after the Rwandan genocide? Why was it the Western world when we went in there were like, hey, let's support these people with trauma work. And after a while, the Rwandans were like, yeah, go. Our trauma work happens outside in sunshine, in the dance, in the circle with other people, not in a room sitting with somebody.
Yeah, exactly. The technology I feel of and the intelligence of village ways of ritual, of coming together, which of course leads me to, I think, another big thread of the work that you do in collaboration with others around grief, and how there is this deep connection between Eros and grief. And I wonder if you might speak to that. And again, just given the context of this conversation, in particular for men, or what have you seen for men in terms of their capacity to both open to like a wider current of Eros, and how might that also relate to the wider capacity of expressing grief and the current of grief?
Yeah. So yeah, Ian, grief and Eros are so related to me that sometimes I speak about it in a similar way that astronomers speak about time and space. They don't separate them. They call it space time. So a lot of times when I think of Eros, actually, I think of like grief Eros. They're that close to each other. When people are in that depth of feeling, it can be hard to tell actually, am I having a crygasm? Am I having a pleasure meltdown? It's just one is the other. So when I think of Eros and when I think of grief, I think of very deep layers of feeling that want and desire movement. Like grief needs to move. Grief needs to a pathway, a channel to like to happen. And often also grief needs witnessing. And I think most effectively in the body of community. And so how that relates to men, I think, is that again, culturally speaking, domestically speaking, men are often required. There's a value of men of not having deep feeling and only having very narrow channels for their feelings. And usually those channels have to do with fucking, fighting. And so I think men oftentimes aren't as in touch or able to be in touch with their grief. That is, I'll just use this word, toxic.
Mm-hmm.
It's painful, and it diminishes us at a cellular. I'm saying us because I identify as a man. But anyway, yeah, at a cellular level, at a spiritual level, at all the levels, it's yeah.
Just it reminds me too. One of my teachers, Stephen Jenkinson, I've studied with for I don't know 13, 14 years. But he used this phrase one time. He said, when grief isn't possible or capable of flowing, then there's only grievance instead.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think for men, it's particular, right? Grievance is often how we operate in the world, right? The sense that, it shouldn't be, or it's, somebody else's problem, or acting out in violent and harmful ways. Even as I, look at the news this morning, another shootout in New York City, you might have heard of that one. It sounds like a young man, again, perhaps with a level of grievance of, just needing to take it out on whoever happens to be the target. And also for women often, right, are the target of that grievance. I think of involuntary celibates, right, incels and things like that, where I think that lack of ability to grieve, actually, which feels like maybe not being able to access, the feminine sexuality or something, right? That calcifies and toxifies into grievance, right? Instead of actually the grief of that, actually, which is a big part of that. It kind of needs to alchemize differently instead of become aggression. So I just wanted to highlight that. If I think of what you're saying as like the consequence of not being able to access grief.
Yeah. Yeah. And here's another highlight for you. So thinking about, again, Saban Fusame, one of her sayings was that when we do not allow ourselves to grieve, we make grief for other people. And so when I look out in the world and I see all the things that are happening, when I think about our leaders, one in particular, but not just him. I see these generations of men that are not allowed to be vulnerable, that their entire identity is based on domination and not appearing weak and not allowing a damn thing in, and supported by the culture in that, and they make a lot of grief for a lot of us, and then a painful piece of that is that because we're all in that, a lot of us take that as that's the way it's supposed to be. Yeah.
No, I'm struck by this image or this often condition that men have around, opening up to emotions, opening up to sensitivity, to grief, makes you weak, right? Makes you weak, makes you vulnerable. And there's a fair amount of commentary, not just from the alt-right or the manosphere, right? This idea that, we don't need men connecting to their feminine or their weak, we need strong men. That's what we need, to fight whatever conflict or threats that are there. And I think that there's, Robert Bly also had this phrase, right? He called them this rise of the soft male, right? And he wasn't saying it actually as a criticism so much as he was saying that, men who had done this is now sort of the 80s, 90s, when some of this stuff was coming more online, this emotional sensitivity and things like that. The sensitive new age guy is kind of another archetype of that. This idea of the man that has connected to the feminine, but then also lost something else along the way. Right? You could call it a kind of fierce masculinity or a strong masculinity. And I think, at least what my understanding is, and maybe what you're saying, to skillfully have access to bring forth and experience the pulse of Eros, as well as the surrender to grief, right? And that life energy. To me, that actually seems that it makes you a more resilient, soulful, powerful man, I would say.
Yeah. And Ian, I think I see it like this. Sometimes I step away from some of the language of, masculinity and femininity, not all the times, but I think of it in terms of men deserve, and many men want more access to their full range of feeling, whatever we call it, whether it's masculine, feminine, whatever. And that, again, I'm going to make a sweeping statement across the board. It's not true across the board, but when I think about people in less colonized contexts, they often do have more access to a wider range of feeling. And within that, being able to connect with other people and with other men in that. So, when I think about people in more indigenous contexts, there's a lot of focus on cooperation. In order to get stuff done, you have to cooperate, whether if you're in a hunter-gatherer group, you're out doing that. It's not typically one man for himself. It's like a group effort to get done what needs to get done. So cooperation means attuning, and attuning means feeling. So that's a relevant, usable human skill, and it's a skill that, again, that we've been sort of trained away from, because we've been trained to be self-sustaining, singular, invulnerable, untouched. That's And I deal with that myself. I'm like, why am I not asking for help? Why am I pretending I'm okay? Why, and I be gentle with myself and then go, okay, yeah, you're doing that thing. You could ask for help right now. You're actually in a men's circle that would love to give you support, advice, a hand with this thing that you're like going, So
yeah, and maybe I'll punctuate that too by saying I think that it takes humility for a man to admit help and to need help and to admit vulnerability. And I find often in men's circles that I have been to and support, it's like once a man realizes, oh, that this actually allows him to access deeper aspects of his soul and a sense of solidarity and connection to other men, like it actually upgrades him. If a circle's done well, it upgrades him on like every level. And so the idea that you're supposed to be self-sustaining, right, and that to actually reach out for support, particularly from other men, is somehow a weakness. It's a tragedy, of course, because so many men today suffer in silence and inner pain, and suicide rates are sky high and all the rest. And so yes, it's clear that fallacy of the lone wolf is kind of run its path. But I'd be curious for you to maybe end in this conversation with exploration of a term I heard you use called your erotic ecosystem. And my curiosity so let's say a man listening, and not just men, but let's say a man's listening is like, wow, I really want to start applying some of this understanding to my life. And how do I begin to like map my erotic ecosystem and perhaps identify areas in which, I'm realizing, I'm kind of not allowing the flow of Eros, or I'm blocked around certain things, or the way I live in my partnership, actually kind of stifles Eros. And so how might I begin to understand how to map this territory and how to, start to make shifts?
Yeah. So the erotic ecosystem is, so like we were saying earlier, it can be hard to know the bowl you're in when you're in the bowl. Okay. So starting to map this is like starting to get more intelligent and more observational about like what's in my bowl. What's the water that I'm swimming in. And so that's the first piece, is like starting to identify the things that are hard to see. And then from that, the bowl, the other word I would use, ecosystem, context, kind of interchangeably. And so when you start noticing that, when you start to own that, then you can start to do, I call them experiments with it. So for instance, one experiment that I do a lot with couples actually is, if you have the privilege to do this and you're like cohabitating with each other. So one of the things we know about domesticated sexuality is that it tends to look like this. And we tend to be psychically and emotionally and physically enmeshed with each other. And that's, all the songs sing about it.
Sure.
So if that's you and you have the privilege and the ability to do it, what's it like to create more space with your partner? Not space like going away, but space to give yourselves, instead of this, give yourself that and see what happens. And so that might look like, the privilege part is like, maybe you have another room, you occupy different rooms. Maybe if you have, again, privilege to go on things like vacation or whatever, maybe like what happens when one of you goes to do your thing, the other person does another thing. What happens when a simple one is like, hey, we're going to go to this event. We'll just play with it. What's it like to go separately and meet there and not like walk in as like Mr. and Mrs. whatever, and see what happens, see what it brings up in you. It's going to bring up probably discomfort, but you also might start to notice other things. So that's that's one of a million experiments, but it's a pretty common one. Yeah.
Thanks for that. I also want to, I'm curious, a friend of mine uses the term polysensual, which, he didn't invent, but he said he's monogamous in his partnership and very happily monogamous sexually, but he feels himself to be very polysensual, which is that he likes to share, like nourishing touch with men and women and, cuddles and, things like that. And I think for couples who may be thinking about, how do we sort of invite in a little more spaciousness around eros or attraction, but not fully open, fling the doors open and introduce like other
Yeah.
sexual partners, which can be a lot of new energy, right? And can trigger lots of attachment patterns and things like that. But how to create maybe some like experiments of just a little bit of, relaxing the proximity to, allow a bit more of a nourishing touch with others, in social events and, things like that could be another step, I think. And I wonder for you, any others like that?
Yeah. Yeah. So just to underscore that one, I would call that more experiments around erotic sovereignty. And to put it bluntly, there's a blunt way and a softer way. I'll do both. The blunt way is, what's it like to get comfortable, or at least to get accepting of knowing that your partner wants to fuck other people, and that's really normal. That's who we are as humans. And the softer way is, what's it like to get comfortable, understand that your partner has interests, pleasures, desires around people, around things that are other than you, and that it's actually a benefit. It's a erotic and relational benefit to make space for that, and not to try to like control them and pull them in to everything all the time. So that's the hard way and the softer way. I think the harder way is really useful, because it like really jolts people. It's like, if you can get comfortable with that, whether we're not even talking about non-monogamy, just like to know that, then you start to develop this muscle of like, oh yeah, it's actually useful for me to like see my partner wherever we are. We're out somewhere and they're talking with someone else, or they're flirting with someone else, or they're touching them, whatever. And it's like, oh yeah, you are a human that's interested in other humans, and that's okay. And we have whatever our agreements are. If the agreement is monogamy, we trust each other enough to be like, when it comes down for the deeper sexual, more intimate stuff, you're coming here. I think contact improv is a really wonderful practice. A lot of reasons, but that's one of them. I've done contact improv for years.
This is dance you're speaking of. Contact improv dance.
Yes. Yeah, contact improv dance. And so one of the mainstays in that dance form is that you are in fairly intimate physical contact with whoever you want to be in the room. You do your dances, and when people go there in their relationships, it can be used as an experiment. I remember when I first did contact, I did it for, still do it, but for a long time, you'd be like, oh, the two of you were together as a relation. I didn't even know that, because we're all like, so doing this. Then you like, oh, that's right. They're walking to the car together. They're a couple.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. I also agree. And having also experienced in contact improv dance, that, there's this kind of, it can feel like a safe enough releasing of a partnership into a social field of experimentation that is intimate but non-sexual. And I think, can open that muscle of like, okay, they're their own person, and like, I don't control them. And, seeing them interact with someone else in an intimate way can be very beautiful, actually. Yeah. Right. When it's not triggering like deep feelings of fear or anxiety around attachment, right? Which I think that goes back to the point we made earlier, that in a context where our deepest sense of home and belonging is in a nuclear partnership, then of course that's the conditions for those things to get activated when you suspect or understand that your partner actually is drawn to others in different erotic ways, whether or not they act on it. And so in a different context, that maybe that can relax a bit, in a village context where it's like, okay, cool, my belonging isn't threatened when my partner or lover wants to possibly connect with someone else. It's like, there's still feelings possibly, right, of like, a little envy or jealousy or something, but maybe it's not catastrophic, right, as it so often is.
Right.
Yeah. Right. In other context.
Yeah. And there are potentially feelings to navigate and work with, versus feelings to then externalize and create control over another person
Yeah.
and their body.
Yeah.
And it's hard because, outside of the whole domesticated sphere, people just have different levels of this. I mean, some people are naturally coming to the world and they're more like, more alarmed, and some people are less so. So it's different for everyone. It's not like a cookie cutter thing, but I think it's a muscle that's worth developing in ways that you are willing to and can be tolerant of without breaking yourself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Victor,
gently.
Really, yeah, exactly. I'm very appreciative for our conversation today, Victor. And I wonder, as we wind to a close, I would love to hear the vision of possibility. The more beautiful world that you're in service to. What does that look like? When you allow yourself to envision, maybe even like not so far in the future, but even in the nearest term, what does it look like for folks to rewild their eros, and how might society be different and better, and more beautiful because of that?
That's a good question. So, well, the first thing I always like to remind myself of and remind people I'm working with is that when you're rewilding, when you're domesticating, when you're decolonizing your body, your eros, whatever, you to be extra kind to yourself, because this is a few hundred years, or I would just say hundreds of years of domestication and thousands of years of other than that. So anyway, I like to remind people and myself, you're not going to just like get rid of this in an afternoon or in a weekend workshop. In fact, we're talking about multi-generation. So, but then what does it look like is for myself, and hopefully for people that I work with or contact with, is having an ongoing practice and an ability to have curiosity about moving further into feeling, moving further into the body, stepping away from, or at least examining the privileges that keep us separate from each other, or separate from feeling responsible for each other. And maybe I'll end with this. When I say eros and I mention community, most people think about danger. But it's like, oh, eros, and you want to tamp down eros in community. You want to, like, if you're talking about work or whatever, it's a thing to be controlled, avoided, not spoken about, and also eros usually means sex. And I just love to reframe that and let people know that actually eros done well, and in the ways that I'm talking about it, is a resource. It actually makes communities better. When I think about communities without eros available, it feels like a neighborhood. It feels pretty dry. And so to have a group of people that consider themselves community or in connection with each other, that feel alive with each other, that feel connected with each other, where there's that web of support with each other, that's erotic, and it's a resource. And so if I have a vision, one vision is supporting people in understanding.
Beautiful. Well, Victor, thanks so much for your time today. Really enjoyed our conversation.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Thank you for listening to this episode with Victor Waring. If you'd like to check out his work, visit rewilderos.com for resources and services, links to his work, and upcoming events. And if you enjoyed this episode, please feel free to share it on your social media, email to your friends. It really helps me to spread the word and connect with the right folks who would find value in these conversations. Thank you.